I'm so pleased to have Peter Kingsley with me here in my office in Zurich. We are at Münstergasse 9, just down the street from the Grossmünster Church, in a historic building, speaking about bringing the deep past, the archaic past, alive into our times, into the spirit of our times, bringing it back somehow, and the difficulties with this, and how Jung's Red Book might contribute to this effort to approach the mysteries of the deep past and of the deep unconscious in such a way that we do not fall into defensiveness, that we can allow ourselves to engage in these mysteries and be transformed by them as Jung was. And so Peter is an expert on ancient Greek philosophy, religion, religious practices, and he is sharing with us the results of his research he's been conducting on Jung, the Red Book, its relation to these mysteries, in a book that will be published later this year or perhaps next year. We're very much looking forward to your book, Peter.
Well, I look forward to our discussion and questions. I think that there's one thing I'd like to say to begin with, which is something that came to me last night. And it has to do with the conversation we had a few weeks ago. And I was very impressed and very moved by something you said. Here we are together now. My main area is, as you say, ancient Greece. And of course, the question there is, what is the relevance of that to Jung? And then there is Jung himself saying, if you want to understand my psychology, you need to understand the Bible back to front, you need to be able to speak Greek fluently, you need to be able to speak Latin fluently and understand them. And of course that rules out many people in the Jungian world. Just about everybody is out. So here am I coming from a rather strange area to do with Jung and past, if you like, deep past, not 19th century cultural context, which has been quite popular, but deep past. And this is me on the one side, and then there is you on the other side, and this is where I come back to our conversation a few weeks ago, where, if I remember right, and if I understand right, you said that really the Red Book is something so extraordinary, so potent, so unique, that you don't have much hope that it's ever going to be incorporated into the Jungian analytical training, whether that's in Switzerland or the rest of Europe or South America or North America or Asia or wherever. And I think you made, it's in my memory, you making a couple of comments that somehow you felt that the Red Book is this text by Jung that was published in 2009, that it's somehow making you aware, maybe, and a few other people aware, that there is something missing in Jungian work in general, that somehow the thread has, maybe the thread has been lost, that something has been lost.
When I first read the Red Book in 2009 when it came out, I was very put off by it. I couldn't get into it. I couldn't get into the English. I didn't like the English language translation. So I read it in German. Reads much better in German to me. It's Jung's language. But it takes a long time to find yourself entering into that world effectively, I find. And when I think about the relation of the Red Book to the collected works, to Jung's other writings, it's a bit like the difference between poetry and prose. The Red Book is poetry, it is prophecy, it is biblical, it's a different kind of language, a different way of thinking from his usual discourse in his scientific works. And scientific works are much easier for modern people to read, to get into. And even those are difficult for a lot of people. Jung is not easy to understand, and the Red Book is harder than the other works, I find. So it's a challenge, and I would like to accept that challenge. I would like to say, yes, the Red Book is essential to understanding Jung's psychology and Jung's mind and Jung's approach to life, and we can't really get the depth and the best of Jung unless we go deeply into the Red Book and understand it and absorb it, integrate it into the rest of what we understand about Jung. But whether that's realistic to propose something like that to the training programs that are very much in place and established and have gone their own directions, I'm not optimistic about it. I think the Red Book was not so well received at first by the Jungian community. A lot of people thought it should never have been published. That was private, something for Jung alone. That's why he didn't publish it. Other people found it somewhat interesting. I found it fascinating after I got into it, written a bit about it. And now we're doing these 3 volumes of essays on Jung, Jung's Red Book for our time. But I want to, in our discussion, see if we can flush out the depth of what's in the Red Book more. And for that, we really have to go to these Greek sources. We have to go way back to the sources of Western culture, because that's where Jung goes in the Red Book, I believe. I'm with you.
Good. But I think that for me, it's very important to try and put this in context, because still, to me, there is the question, why should anybody who is a Jungian practitioner, analyst, therapist, why should they be concerned with the past? What is the need? You know, we want to know about the past to help us go into the future. But is that even that the right attitude? You mentioned about Liber Novus when we spoke before, the new book. Mm-hmm. So here is Jung writing the Red Book, which for him is the Liber Novus, the new book. We can actually say very specifically what Jung meant, what he implied, what he was getting at by calling the Red Book Liber Novus. But the point that I find so interesting is, even when Jung is calling his Red Book New Book, he writes New Book in Latin, an old ancient language. Mm-hmm. And there's a paradox there, but there is also a logic there. And I think that unless we start to sink into this logic of old and new together, we're not really going to get to what Jung was what the project was about.
Mm-hmm. One thing that struck me when I read it and continues to impress me is that the conversations he has and the figures who come to him are from the deep past. They're not even from the near past.
Correct.
They're not from the 19th century, 18th century. Goethe's not in there, Schiller's not in there, Nietzsche's not in there. He isn't having conversations with those people. He goes back to biblical figures, Elijah and Salome, Philemon, a Gnostic teacher, Isdemar, character from the East, Gilgamesh. Why go back so far? My impression is, my conclusion from having looked at this, is that he's reaching for something timeless.
I think there's something that we're missing here. And to talk about the timeless, I think, is to go beyond something. I think we need to go back and take the past, this deep past, very seriously for what it is. And the reason why I mentioned this about Liber Novus, that the new is phrased in terms of the old, that when Jung says he's writing a Liber Novus, which of course he never publishes, when he says he's writing a new book, he's actually using an old language. There is a reason for this, and actually, to me, the reason, the explication of this paradox is in the Red Book. There's this very beautiful paragraph, I'm sure you're familiar with it, where he says, but I think every word of this is very, very important and has to be taken seriously. And if I remember right, he says, the task is to give birth to the old in a new time. And then he goes into even more detail, and he talks about, I suppose one could use the word creativity, but I think it's better to use the word creation because it's something even deeper than our personal creativity. He says true creation, and I think I'm paraphrasing here, true creation is to give birth to the primordially ancient in a world that is new. Now, he is not saying creation or the task is to give birth to the new. No, he says it's to give birth to the primordially ancient. It's to give birth to the old in the new. The new looks after itself. The new is this world we live in. He is concerned with bringing the ancient into the new. And to bring the ancient into the new, you have to know the ancient. You have to be with the ancient. You have to be at home with the ancient. You have to understand the ancient. And this, to me, is the context, the emphasis for Jung, is his work was, yes, something new, a new book, but it's in Latin for a reason, because the new is the old. Because the new is giving birth to the old, to the ancient. And that is his work. You cannot just give birth to the new without being at home in the ancient, in the primordially ancient. And I find it psychologically very interesting that we nowadays, in the 21st century, find it very, very, very difficult to get a grip on this. Again, I think I'm quoting here from the Red Book. Well, yes, I am quoting, because I remember it made such an impression on me. Don't look forward so much, but back and into yourself, in case you fail to hear the dead. Don't look forward too much, and we're doing that all the time. We're looking forward. He's saying don't look forward so much, but back and into yourself, in case you fail to hear the dead. And the dead are our ancestors. The dead are the ancient. The dead are not just our father or mother or grandparents. The dead are thousands of years in the past. Everything that is incomplete, that we have to live out and take up and resolve as much as we can in our lifetimes. And this is something very, very important. Again, the dead. I know that people are writing a bit about this. It's such an important theme. But, for example, towards the end of his life, I came across a beautiful passage where, towards just a few years before he died, Jung was in despair. And he said, as he said so many times, especially as he was getting older, nobody understands me. And he was very clear, he meant nobody. He says, nobody understands me. Everybody is copying me, imitating me. And by that, he was referring to Jungians in his close circle. He wasn't referring to people he met out in the street. Everybody is imitating me, copying me, and nobody understands that you have to find your own dead. He said, people want to take my dead. They're copying me, they're taking my dead, what I say about my dead, and trying to make my dead into their dead, but they have to find their own dead. And he said, but the trouble is people are too lazy. They can't be bothered. It's too much effort. And then, of course, the other factor which you referred to a little while ago, the other factor is this with the two personalities. Personality number one, as Jung called it, and personality number two. So personality number one corresponds loosely to the spirit of this age. It is our personality. It's what we use, what we are in order to get by, to have a nice, affable personality and to play tricks on people and God knows what. And then number two is the mystery. Personality number two is the personality of the depths. It is this secret, this hidden, dark personality, this dark side of our personality. And as you know, Murray, very well, for Jung, this number two personality, which he speaks about especially in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, one of the most important aspects of it is its ancientness. Number two personality is what is in us, what we are, which belongs to 200 or 2,000 years ago.
Now, I really like what you're saying, Peter. I find it fascinating and very provocative. Our project is to discuss Jung's Red Book for our time. And what you're saying is that what this would amount to is making the deep past present to our time. How would we do that?
I think I'd like to just turn it around the other way, and then we can go on and go deeper, I hope. Number two personality is this ancient personality in us. But let's be human about it. Let's be practical psychologically and look at what happened. I mean, this is something that, again, I was very surprised looking at the literature, speaking to people who knew people and so on. And it's so interesting, the difference between Jung and the people close to Jung and the people around Jung, the later Jungian literature. With Jung, there is this numinous connection with personality number two. And in spite of what some people have said, there are ways in which he identified with personality number two, especially when he was at Bollingen, especially the whole pull back that the Red Book represents, being drawn back inside himself. He never identifies with the spirit of the depths, but he does yield to it. He's forced to, and he has to go into there, and he has to speak. And there are points where the spirit of the depths says, speak on my behalf, you have to speak for me. Now that is a form, a subtle form of identification. When you let something speak through you, the identification is there, even however conscious you are. But what I find interesting is how people step back from number two. As I say, even the people who were quite close to Jung. There is this element of fear. There is this element of, oh no, number two personality is to do with crazy youth, it's to do with hallucinogenic drugs, it's to do with and it's like paying lip service to number two, if you know what I mean. It's like, yes, of course, personality number two is there. But let's breathe rapidly, and personality number two is over there, and we're here firmly in personality number one. And yes, of course, there is personality at number two. But the thing is, there is no of course with personality number two. That you can't do that. There is no. The number two personality is, biblically, is the thief that breaks into your house in the middle of the night. It is the spirit of the depths. It is the voice calling from the underworld when you least expect it. And really to come to terms with that means having to make this descent into hell, into the underworld.
Which is what Jung does.
Which is what Jung does.
In the Red Book, yeah.
Which is what Jung does. So...
And that's what analysis has purported to do. Now, analysis is a very multifaceted enterprise, and people are trained to work as psychotherapists, counselors, surface levels, dealing with symptoms, mostly dealing with personality number one, adjustment, adaptation. But in what I have called and written about occasionally is advanced individuation, you do engage this level of personality number two, maybe not nearly to the extent that Jung did, but in dreams, in active imagination. Red Book is all active imagination. A few dreams are told, recorded, but he's working in active imagination. which I think in our earlier discussions you've said to me isn't really understood. What is active imagination? And there you bring in Corbin and the world of the image, imaginal. It is engaging that world and letting that world speak to you. And that, I think, is occasionally done within the context of Jungian analysis. But the training programs, by and large, do not train analysts to do that. They have to learn that on their own as they age, as they mature, as they continue studying. But within the context of training programs, I would say it's done, if at all, very light, extremely light. And that is in conformity with the spirit of our times, which is fast-paced, yes, wanting solutions now, wanting to correct various and adjust various parts of the personality that handicap you from getting ahead and doing well in our society. Yes, I agree with you that the training programs have not really encouraged the development of that kind of deep engagement with personality number two, with patients or with themselves.
Well, Jung was quite brutal many times throughout his life about the difficulty of and the rareness of individuation.
Yeah.
He never said this is for everybody or this is even for many. He was very selective and not exclusive.
And there we run into the problem of elitism, quotes,
exactly,
you know.
Yes, which is another whole issue, although interestingly, according to mythology, ancient Greek mythology, Orpheus was put to death, was killed because of his elitism. So there are very interesting threads running through and backwards and forwards here historically. And of course, Jung masterfully managed to avoid that. There were many ways in which, through the sheer force of his being, he was able to avoid the accusations and avoid the reality of elitism.
Yes.
But then there is the question of at what cost? You know, what you say I understand and I totally sympathize with, and it's beautiful, it's wonderful, whatever can be done in this world. But I still see Jung in his library reading ancient Greek texts saying, true imagination is different from fantasy. True imagination is to perceive ta ontos onta. And he was reading, I have to emphasize again, he was reading in the ancient Greek. And that means true imagination means seeing what really truly is. And this is really quite extraordinary, because
the
now
ontic.
We're talking... I'm sorry?
The ontic.
Yes, the ontic, but the ontic of the ontic, ta ontos onta. This is the hyper-ontic. This is to see the reality behind the reality. That is what active imagination was for Jung. This is what he was annotating in his library. This is what he was discussing with Henry Corbin. They both realized there is a difference between active imagination. And by the way, it was Jung who put Corbin on to a lot of his interest in true imagination to begin with. Corbin had other sources, Coiré and others, but it was Jung who really opened up the world of imagination for Corbin, interestingly. But this is one of the aspects of their relationship that has come out in this book that I'm trying to finish now. But
and Jung's source was...
I'm sorry?
Jung's source for understanding imagination.
Jung's source was, primarily, as we know, say from psychology and alchemy, his main source was alchemical texts. The Rosarium and other texts, but then there were the other, as I discovered, these ancient Greek texts as well. So there is quite a story there to do with imagination. And as I say, it's not just the historical story about what Jung was reading and what he was thinking, but when you have active imagination, for Jung actually being the perception, the vision, the cognition of what truly is. This is why I said to you a few weeks ago, I wonder how many people even now really understand what active imagination is, because this is setting the bar very high, or very low, if you like. You really have to go very, very deep down inside yourself.
You remind me of that moment, famous moment in Face to Face, where John Freeman asks Jung, "Do you believe in God?" And Jung says, I have problems believing anything I know.
I know.
But there you are. I mean, that's how he knows. It's a knowing.
Yeah.
It's a gnosis. It's a knowing by experience and seeing.
Yes. And there he is repeating what Philemon said 50 years earlier,
Yes.
half a century earlier to him.
When he asks him, how do you know?
Yes, he learned the lesson.
Philemon is his teacher. Yes.
But there, Philemon can say to Jung in the Red Book, I don't believe I know. Then almost half a century later on the BBC, Jung says it. That is his number two personality speaking. I know.
Yeah.
There is number two, no longer as Philemon, but as Jung himself.
There you are.
Yeah.
So does number two become number one in the course of his lifetime?
No, I think there are always the differences. Jung always knew how to play the game, to smile in the photos, even when he was hellishly depressed, even when he was going through excruciating experiences, not just 1913 onwards during the Red Book, during the descent, but later on in his life. He always knew how to put on a mask, which I think is very much an aspect of personality number one. And the number two was kept hidden even from Ruth Bailey, even from the people around him. He could manage to keep these two levels, I would say, separate all along.
Who do you think really knew him the most deeply?
Very, very surprising. I mean, to look at it, you look, again, it's paradox and surprise. I don't know. I mean, I could say who I don't think understood him so well, but that doesn't really help. But in terms of who did, I find, for example, to me, one of the person who made the most perceptive comments about Jung and personality number one and number two, and having to know when you're dealing with Jung, having to see and look in the moment, where's he coming from? Is he coming from number one or number two? Was Hull.
Hull.
Jung's English translator, who was, of course, ostracized by the Jung community in Zurich. They all looked down at him from the top of their noses and said, oh, he's an intellectual, he doesn't understand what he was doing. He's one person who I think understood very well. Carrie Baines, again, I would come back to, Carrie Diangolo. There were people who understood.
Toni Wolff, you think?
Sure.
She's often given credit for making the journey with him during this time. Yeah.
Of course.
Emma?
I think so. I mean,
yeah.
I think she...
Von Franz.
Michael Forden has some interesting reminiscences about things that Emma said to him, would suddenly blurt out within dinners. She was very, very perceptive, very, very shrewd. But should we go on to Orpheus? Would that help?
Yes.
And then just open it up, as it were.
Let's go to
Would that
Orpheus.
be a good idea?
Yeah.
You have written about, and you've obviously spoken, because the article in Journal of Analytical Psychology that I'm thinking of, that was based on a conference lecture that you gave. You have talked and written about Jung and Orphic tradition, Orpheus. And this has obviously come to the forefront with the Red Book. There's going to be much more coming with the Black Books. As far as Orpheus is concerned, and Orphic tradition, Orphic theology, the god Phanes. So I think maybe I should just say something introductory about Orpheus. Orpheus himself is a mythical, legendary figure. And he was a very, very great teacher, a very great mystic, a great poet. And there is the Orphic tradition, which is a very mystical tradition even in the ancient Greek world, it was considered really the most mystical, very, very, very unusual in many respects. You have transmigration, reincarnation, very much to do with the soul, the past, the future of the soul is connected. All of this is the area of Orpheus. Orpheus was also a founder of mysteries. So again, we come back to mysteries.
Mysteries, yeah.
And Orpheus, there are traditions of Orpheus's centrally important descent into the underworld. Mm-hmm. Again, and this can be kind of missed if we're just looking at aspects of Orphic tradition in the Red Book. Orpheus was a founder of mysteries. He's a man who descends into the underworld, a being who descends into the underworld. Very important traditions also, I documented
Calling
this.
for the soul.
Calling for the soul, yes.
Yeah.
Very important traditions which I documented in my first book, Ancient Philosophy, Mystery and Magic, but I'm going to in much more depth in this new book that I'm just finishing now, preparing on Jung, about incubation. Orphic tradition is very much connected with incubatory practice, which is essentially the practice of lying down in a dark place, usually a sacred place, to fall asleep or often go into a state which is neither sleep nor waking, in between, where you have dreams. Incubation was the practice of evoking dreams. So there are dream oracles dotted around, especially Italy, Sicily, which are connected with Orphic tradition as well. And Orpheus was connected with incantations and magical spells. Mm-hmm. And he was historically, and Jung knew this very well, Orpheus and Orphic tradition in the ancient world were connected very closely with certain figures. For example, Parmenides, Empedocles. Jung was familiar with this area. And again, I document these connections in my new book because they are all very important, very relevant to Jung. Now, the next question then is, how does Jung come across Orpheus and Orphic traditions? Well, certainly there is the passageway through Goethe, but that is not the main point of access, doorway that Jung had to Orpheus. It was mainly through his own texts in his own library, ancient Greek texts, texts by certain scholars, specialists in ancient Greek mysteries. Jung read these books, studied them, devoured them as soon as they came out. Interestingly, you can see actually how quick he was around 1910, 1911, 1912, how quick he was to buy these books as soon as they were published, usually in German, and devour them and read them. And suddenly you'd find within a year or the next year, he's starting to publish on this material. And this again is, of course, just before the Red Book period. So these are the texts, and one very important aspect that comes out historically, and also again through Jung's interest, is Orphic tradition was very important for Jung because he recognized in it a major antecedent, predecessor of the Gnostics.
Very important because Jung traces his psychology back to Gnosticism, and he said alchemy provided the link. But then behind Gnosticism, we have Orphism.
Correct.
So that's
correct.
Direct connection between Jungian psychology, let's say, modern expression of these themes, directly back to the mysteries in the Orphic tradition.
Yes, this is the.
A thread.
This is yes. I'm sorry.
A thread.
A thread, and he didn't. He deliberately left the pre-Gnostic period obscured.
Yeah.
And again, this is something I write about. It's very interesting.
Deliberately.
He deliberately left it obscured. It was enough for him to go back publicly to the Gnostics. Even that caused him a lot of trouble. He didn't like to be identified with Gnostics, even with the Jung Codex, even with the Nag Hammadi discoveries. Yeah. He really got very nervous.
And Buber called him a Gnostic. Very upsetting to him.
Yes, absolutely. He wanted to keep out of it. But this going back behind the Gnostics to Orphic tradition, to Empedocles, Jung talks about it. He writes about it. He mentions in seminars and other places. But this is something he didn't want to go into publicly. But it's real. And you can see how real it is, especially through the Red Book. This is a prehistory of Jungian psychology that we're coming to now before the Gnostics.
And it has to do with incubation and initiation.
Yes.
I read this as an initiation book.
Yes.
The Red Book is an initiation into the mysteries.
Absolutely.
An account.
Yes.
Yeah.
And incubation. And again, this is a point that I go into in my book. I'm sorry to repeat this, but I have to, because I'm just trying to just skim a little off here and there and just touch a little on the themes. I mean, this is going to be a very big book, the biggest book I've ever written. And one of the points that I mentioned, and to be honest with you, this is a point that I put in a note, because half of the book is notes and essays about the main text. Because to me, we are so far away from a real understanding of Jung, an understanding of the history relating to Jung, the real history, the historical continuity. I had to do these huge notes, and a lot of the most important material is actually put in the notes.
I love notes.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the points I mention is that when you compare the dropping that Jung experienced, going down into the experiences that he documents in the Black Books and in the Red Book, as he mentions in Introduction to Jungian Psychology, he talks there quite a bit about the techniques he used for dropping down inside himself.
Yeah.
Classic incubation.
Yeah.
You know, these are the classic incubation techniques used by Greeks and Romans 2,000 years ago, still documented in ancient Greek sources for going down. He belonged in a tradition. And I know we can talk about influences on the Red Book, Staudenmeier and so, but incubatory tradition is a huge, huge factor in this.
Central. Absolutely central. Yeah.
So
there's the C.A. Meyer book on incubation.
Yes.
That's the
Yes.
The dream incubation.
Yes, which was the
Asclepius.
first volume in the C.G. Jung Institute research publications program, I think, or research program publications. And I think that was the intention of the C.G. Jung Institute.
As a research.
To begin with, as a research facility before it became what it became, a training facility.
Yeah.
But yes, and again, number one volume, if I believe.
I think you're right, yeah.
So if I can just go on, I'd like to give an example of Orpheus, and you asked me about going to Jung's library.
Yeah.
See, again, to me, this is not just historically important, this is very, very important for Jung, very important. We have the editor of the Red Book pointing out, admittedly just in a footnote, but pointing out Phanes, 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 which is one of the gods of the Orphic theology, the literature ascribed to Orpheus. Phanes is Jung's God.
Right, I remember
this
that.
This is a point you've picked up on. Not many people have. I'm very happy you have. This is really quite a statement. Phanes is Jung's God. And, well, just to say about Phanes very, very quickly, I mean, one can read up about Phanes. Phanes comes from the Greek phaino or phainome, which is, it's to do with appearance, light, but light out of the darkness. It's to do with manifestation. This is really a god of primordial manifestation. For Jung, Phanes was connected with the sun. That I should say straight away, this is the sun for Jung, S-U-N. This is the sun, not as we think of the sun, this is the primordial sun. This is the sun in the sense that he discussed with Native Americans in New Mexico, with Mountain Lake in Taos.
Yeah.
This is the sun, the primordial sun of creation, rising at the dawn of creation, and of course every day that he came across in Africa. And again, just as a side point, I think it's important to mention that what Jung discovered through his encounters with Native Americans in New Mexico, especially Mountain Lake, of course, and what he discovered in Africa in his time there, why this was so important, we can see this now with the Red Book, is that he was actually finding elders, wise people in these traditions who were saying essentially the same as what he'd said in the Red Book. They came from the same place, they came from the same depths that Jung had already experienced. So what affected him so much in his discussions at Taos, for example, was not just hearing something new, it was hearing the confirmation, the recognition of something that he already knew inside him. So you have Phanes, this mysterious God of manifestation who comes before, way before the creation of our physical world, who is Jung's God. An Orphic God, a God of Orpheus, is Jung's God. This will be quite shocking to many people, many Jungians, I'm sure. But then there's the other problem, which is apparently a problem, which is, where does Aion fit into this? Aion, A-I-O-N, being the God of time, the God of eternity, whom Jung experienced becoming in December 1913. And again, one of the very, very important experiences that goes into the Red Book, the deification experience of becoming this lion-headed ancient God from the Mithraic mysteries, which does have its connection with Orphic mysteries historically, the God Aion of the Mithraic mysteries. He is deified, he becomes this God. And if I could again, if you'll allow me just to say in parenthesis here, I've noticed that people who really, really should know better, reputable Jungian authors and experts, they will say, oh, well, of course, when Jung had his deification experience of becoming the god Aion, this wasn't a literal deification, it was just symbolic. And I don't know if we'll have the time today to talk about symbolism, maybe not, but maybe we could do it some other time. What is the symbol? But this to me is, well, not to me, this factually is a total travesty of what Jung said repeatedly, especially in the Red Book, but not by any means only in the Red Book about Jung. There is no such thing as just a symbol. And people who say that something, his deification was not literal, it was just symbolic, honestly, this is just really, really such a misunderstanding.
They don't get psychic reality.
No. The symbol is the reality. And of course, this is another whole story we could go into with the symbolon, the Greek meaning, Goethe on the symbol. Paul Bishop gave me this wonderful quote a couple of years ago from Goethe, where Goethe says a symbol is the thing and not the thing, and yet it is the thing. You know, this is the paradoxical spirit. Yes, true imagination. So, Jung deification, we have an issue there. We have a problem because Jung did experience, symbolically or not, and I'm totally happy for it to be symbolic, he experienced becoming this God. So the question there is, what is the relationship between Aion, who is really so important for Jung? And again, I've documented through various sources how important Aion was for Jung and the people around him for the rest of his life. In my book, I've documented that. But there is Aion, as the God whom Jung became. There is Phanes, is Jung's God. What is the connection? And I would just tell this story because I find it very, very interesting. We have to go back 40 years to 1978. Gilles Quispel, who was a colleague of Jung's. I think Quispel was much fonder of Jung than Jung was of Quispel, but I mean, he was a good man. I knew Quispel quite well. We met a lot in the 80s and 90s. Jung's opinion of Quispel was somewhat mixed, but they did have some interesting talks about Gnosticism and about Orpheus. because that was one of the things that Quispel and I used to discuss a lot in the 80s and 90s. It's surprising because Quispel is often supposed to be or presented as someone who talked about the Jewish origins of Gnosticism. Absolutely, but he always emphasized, and especially in our conversations, the ancient Greek and Orphic background to Gnosticism. So
there's a man who knew the languages.
He was there as well, yes. Yeah. And he was translating the Coptic and so on. So we have Quispel in 1978. He published a piece in a Festschrift, in a collection of articles, and it was a piece about Jung and Hesse. And he makes the very interesting comment, which I think has been rather submerged in literature since then. He makes the very interesting comment. He talks about fannies. And you see, this is 1978, but still Quispel already, before the Red Book, he already knew how important fannies was for Jung. He had his sources. And he said, how come fannies was so important for Jung? How come ion was so important for Jung that he actually became ion? And he says, most probably this is because Jung was familiar with and had read carefully Eisler's book, published in 1910 in Munich, Weltenmantel und Himmelszelt, where Eisler has a whole section demonstrating, or what you're going to say, scholastically arguing or demonstrating, that fannies is ion. That all the iconography, the imagery, the traditions of fannies, in fact, became the traditions of ion, that they weren't two separate gods at all, they were always one. And Quispel and I used to talk about that, and he said, yes, I bet you. He didn't ask Jung about that, but he said, I bet you Jung had read that book. Now, when, thanks to your kindness, Andreas Jung, Jung's grandson, invited me to Jung's library a couple of years ago, it was a wonderful experience. You probably know how it works. I went up with Andreas. Well, we had a nice talk, first of all, and then he asked me which books I'd like to look at, and I pulled them out. And then I went into another room, and Andreas, bless him, he came with a wooden tray bearing these books. And the two of them that I'd asked for were the 2 volumes of Eisler's Weltenmantel und Himmelszelt, 1910, Munich, Jung's own edition. And I remember this. I spoke with Andreas and Verena, his wife, afterwards, and we had a good laugh about it, because it's just a way, it's how things work, especially around Jung. So there I was, sitting at the table. I opened it's a huge work. The second volume is over 700 pages long. I knew the exact page reference for where Eisler identifies fannies and ion and says they're the same god. And I looked through both volumes, and to my despair, the books were printed on glossy paper. And Jung cared way too much for his books. He wasn't going to do his usual marginal pencil markings on glossy paper. The book was untouched. Pristine. No marking anywhere, not a single marking. So I opened this second volume, and I have it on the table in front of me. And there is this book that doesn't have a single, which is very, very unusual for Jung, doesn't have a single marginal note, a single pencil marking anywhere, a single comment or underlining or anything to give you a clue about what Jung was reading or what he wasn't. And I was looking at this pristine book, not a single marking in it. There was the beginning of on the right-hand page, I remember the section where Eisler starts talking about fannies is ion. And I'm looking out the window and I'm saying, this is ridiculous. I don't have a clue here. And suddenly my eyes just went like this. And there, it was in 1910, there was a silk bookmark in each volume. And there was the silk bookmark, still old. It was actually, it had done some marking on the glossy paper on exactly the page I was looking at. So that page I was looking at had been bookmarked, clearly very old. You could see the markings by Jung. That was the passage in the Eisler book that he had marked. So Quispel was absolutely correct. Jung did know it. He had marked that passage where Fanny's is ion.
And this must have been a numinous moment for you.
I laughed. It was nice.
There, eureka.
Yeah. But it was also, again, it's the unexpected. You think that pencil markings are going to be your clue, they're going to be the breadcrumbs, and you give up, and then there's something totally different. So I can't, we don't have time to go into the implications, but here we have Ion, as you know, there is Ion, the volume, published in the 1950s, 40 years after his Red Book, Enterprise, and we have... and
probably his most important book on the self. That's where he really poured himself.
Yes, and the book where he talks so much about the Gnostic.
Yes.
So there is Ion, there is Fanny's. This is something we can't talk about today, maybe some other time if you wish, and if we can do it.
But this is Jung's bringing the ancient figures into the modern time, isn't it?
Yes.
He's making them alive, he's experiencing them. He's experiencing the mysteries through this incubation, initiation process. That's the Red Book. That's what the Red Book tells us.
Yes.
Shows us.
Yes, but I have to add, Murray, it's not just the Red Book, it's Jung's life. If I can just give you an example, and you know about this because you wrote about it in your piece on how and why to read the Red Book. You mentioned something very important. You mentioned Orphic Incantations.
Yes.
You were referring there to the passage, the famous passage, already famous in the Red Book, about Izdubar coming from the east, and Jung has to help him, save him, heal him, and that is through incantations. There is the section heading, Incantations, and this is in the context, as you've pointed out, of Orphic traditions, the egg and so on.
Yeah.
So we have Orphic incantations here, and Jung specifically says in the Red Book, I must recite these incantations nach uralter Weise, in the ancient manner. That's a given.
Uralter.
Yeah, uralter, not alter, uralter.
Uralter.
The primordially ancient, but we know what that means. Goethe had talked about the Orphic tradition. So that is quite clear. We know where we're going with that. We have the Orphic incantations, but I need, again, for me, there is this constant pushing and pulling and dialogue between the Red Book and the rest of Jung's life. Because to me, they feed into each other. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because you think, well, incantation, what does incantation have to do with Jung? Well, it has a lot, actually. Think about that very famous case where Jung, the young teacher who came to Jung because she couldn't sleep and she was very depressed. And how was it that Jung intuitively and mysteriously and magically knew how to heal her? By humming, by chanting a lullaby. And there's a beautiful comment he made just before I would say before he died, the last few years of his life, late 50s, he made a beautiful comment when reciting that in an interview. And he said, if I remember right, he said, enchantment like that is the oldest form of medicine. Now, we're coming to something very interesting here, because here is Jung using enchantment, using incantation, using this lullaby, this humming. We have that one recorded famous example. And of course you could say, or I could say, well, that's just Jung in his more mystical, irrational, number two personality erupting moments. And of course he was the scientist, he rationalized everything, he made it scientific, and this was his unique contribution. He didn't just go with the incantatory nonsense. He made it scientific. And one of the crucial points, which I've been trying to get over in this book, because it's so important, is this is what the Orphic tradition was already doing. Empedocles, for example, who was very important for me, this ancient Greek philosopher, mystic, whom Jung was also familiar with. We know, we have the traditions about him using incantations, chanting, reciting, magical recitations. But also he gave the scientific explanations. Empedocles was making extraordinary discoveries in the fields of biology, chemistry, astronomy, physics. He was the first person we know of in the West to talk about the four elements. He was really working things out, creating a whole infrastructure for science. And here the mysticism and the science, the incantations and the scientific view were hand in hand, just as they were with Jung. And this is so important for putting him in his context.
So we don't split Jung.
So we don't
here you have
split
two,
him.
and here
Yes.
you have one. And, yeah.
Because the splitting, the dichotomies is still coming out with the Red Book. You know, we still have the problem with the Red Book. Well, the Red Book's over there, the collected scientific works are over there. I'm a bit worried about the Red Book, it's a bit too, so we find salvation and safety in the collected scientific works. You probably know who I'm referring to, but there are all these different, if we don't throw the Red Book in the garbage can, what will we do? We'll try and rationalize it, make it acceptable, dilute it, water it down, but we still have these dichotomies. Yeah. And it is so important. Where Jung says enchantment like that is the oldest form of medicine, he is talking about something before Hippocrates, before Hippocratic tradition. We have Hippocratic texts specifically, explicitly attacking Empedocles, who was an Orphic practitioner, because he used incantations and magic. And also, why did the Hippocratic writings also attack Empedocles? They said that kind of doctor, that kind of healer, dares to use incantations, dares to use magic, and also wants to talk about what humans were ex archis, from the beginning. And that's what Empedocles did.
And that's Jung.
And that is Jung, from the beginning. Yeah. This is cosmology now, not metaphysics, but this is evolution, this is biology, this is what Empedocles was doing, this is what Jung was doing. This is not Hippocratic medicine. This is another kind of medicine that has been completely suppressed by Western history, still is completely suppressed in Western academia. It's amazing the ways in which the evidence, the materials are suppressed. If you want to get a grant, if you want to get tenure in a Western university, don't talk about this other tradition. Still, it is taboo in the 21st century.
Shamanic. It's shamanic.
Yes, but it's a Western shamanic tradition.
Yeah.
There is another step to this with the incantations. You see, one example of why it is important to know Greek and Latin if you're going to approach the Red Book, as well as Jung, is, let's take the example, you have the incantations in that episode. Do you remember in that same episode, and just before, Jung is talking about the poison?
Yeah.
And the poison of the West, the poison of science, has to be healed through incantations. Now, the Greek word for incantations, or incantatory spells, is the same as the Greek word for poison. Pharmakon means an incantatory charm, it means an incantatory spell, but it also means poison. But it also means the remedy for the poison. And it also means a magic spell. And if you look at what is happening in the Red Book, and if you look at this language, you see that this is a world of magic that Jung was inhabiting. It wasn't just a chapter in the Red Book. And this magic is dangerous. And this is why, this is really the last point I'd like to make, is we're talking here about magic as something real, the magic of incantation, the magic of healing a patient unexpectedly, the magic of the poison. And there is something very important. Again, you need to know the Greek to understand the significance. Jung often uses the word apotropaic.
Yes.
And it's a very important word for him. What he means by apotropaic is the ancient meaning is, which is, I'm not going to avoid something that frightens me. I'm going to talk about it and be very interested in it and be very respectful of it as a way of getting rid of it. Mm-hmm. Do you understand? Yeah. The more I smother it with my niceness, the more I'm going to put it at a distance and the more I turn it away, which is the word apotropaic, what it means. And Jung, in the Red Book, he talks, there's this amazing passage, you no doubt know, where he talks about, he has all these languages for saying what happens when we are faced with the numinous reality, the sacred, and we need to escape it. And he says, you will use your clever truisms, you will use your escape routes, you will use your potions capable of inducing forgetfulness. Mm. Now that to me is the sign of a real magician, because do you see what he's saying there? He's not just talking about magical potions, he's talking about how ordinary life, the spirit of this time, is also magic. Mm. That is the potion that induces forgetfulness. Mm. Even our ordinary life is a potion, it is magic too. We have here magic against magic. Everything is magic. Ah. Do you understand what I mean?
I do.
And this is something he comes to often.
And but that point is never made, that the magic of the spirit of our times is defensive. It's to keep it at a distance, to keep it away.
Oh, no, he does. If you look at points, say, in Mysterium Conjunctionis, he will have, in the alchemical text, he will have huge paragraphs, yes, and put in references to Michael Meyer and so and so. Yeah. And in it, he will drop these little gems about Michael Meyer's shadow and about the problems and about he was encountering the allergic reaction from the collective around him. And he there brings in this magical terminology. Yeah. It comes in. Yeah. It does come in.
I love that passage.
Yes. Yeah. You know what I'm referring to.
I know exactly what you mean.
It just creeps in all these places. So it is there. He's not going to talk about it, obviously, but it's in his language. It's the way he speaks. It's sometimes in interviews, sometimes in seminars, sometimes it will pop up, and it's the kind of statement that is so easy to just skip over and say, that's just allegory, that's just metaphor.
So it may be that, just to come back and close the circle from where we started, that one of the results of the training programs we have set up, or maybe one of the intentions unconsciously, is to be apotropaic, to keep the numinous at a distance by speaking about the times and staying with the times and the spirit of the times, a kind of magic spell to keep it away. It's possible because it's so powerful. And as soon as you start touching the unconscious, it begins to appear. So how do you deal with it? How do you look into that abyss, talk about it, and distance yourself from it? That's quite an insight to me.
That is, again, I'm so glad to hear you say that, because it's something that, this is a very, very fine knife's edge that we're on. And it's a very fine knife's edge that Jung was on. I think that when he said he didn't want training, and when he actually predicted what would happen to his work in a generation, he wasn't just being pessimistic or making things up. And this, what you say, is yes. I mean, I get the impression sometimes, there is this volume of articles on the numinous, and I have it. In fact, Leon, our friend, I have his copy, and I can't help reading the article sometimes without feeling this article is purely apotropaic. This person is writing very knowledgeably about the numinous as a way of getting rid of the numinous.
Yeah.
And again, maybe it's not about our learning, bringing our learning. It is about, on one level, bringing our learning to bear on the Red Book. But all the time to ask ourselves, is it up to the task? And could it be that really it's not about our learning, but about hearing something? Because there is tremendous pain in the Red Book, tremendous suffering, but there's also something behind the pain. There is a cry from behind the pain, from behind the suffering. And how can we let that cry come up through us, through Jung's work into the world?